Hi everyone, and welcome to Lesson 3, where we introduce the theme of identity. Here are the learning objectives for the week. Our topic is on the fundamental us versus them dynamic that is evident in all cases of genocide. And once again, we're adopting a very interdisciplinary approach. We'll be looking at some social psychology, cognitive psychology, psychoanalysis, some anthropology and sociology, as well as a bit of legal theory. So let's dive in. Reading 1 is another selection from James Waller. This chapter begins with the observation that the capacity for human evil is related to distance. So, for example, it's easier to drop a bomb on an entire city from 30,000 feet than it is to kill one person right up front. Waller briefly references this point in relation to Stanley Milgram's famous obedience to authority experiment from the 1960s, which tested subjects' willingness to administer increasingly harmful shocks on an innocent stranger if they were ordered to do so by an authority figure. Now, both the stranger, who was supposedly being shocked, and the authority figure, who was ordering the shocks, they were both in on the experiment. Okay, so no one was actually being shocked. It was just a setup to see if the test subject would obey. Now, one of the most interesting findings was that if the test subject could directly see and hear the innocent stranger on the other end, then they were less likely to obey commands to increase the shock level. But if there was a physical barrier between the two, if the test subject couldn't see or hear who was on the other side, then they were more likely to follow orders. In other words, the greater the distance between the victim and the subject, the more likely one would act cruelly. Waller also references the earlier work of Helen Fine, the American sociologist we read in week 1. Her first book was a cross-national comparison of Jewish victimization during the Holocaust. There were a number of variables that explained why the Holocaust was more devastating in some countries as opposed to others. Of course, the degree of German control was obviously a major factor, but another key variable was the extent of national solidarity in the occupied society. The more solidarity there was before occupation, the fewer Jewish victims during the Holocaust. Conversely, a greater level of anti-Semitism before the war correlated with more Jewish suffering during the Holocaust. Fine coined the concept the universe of obligation in order to articulate this spatial sense of solidarity, or the lack thereof. Those who are included within the universe of obligation are afforded some degree of respect and protection. Those who fall outside, however, are bereft of such moral considerations. In this sense, Waller recalls a concept that was introduced by Claudia Card in week 1, social death, which makes the destruction of victims easier by increasing the moral distance between victims and perpetrators. And social death can take place early on in the genocidal process, perhaps laying the groundwork for subsequent steps, or it can take place during or even after the fact. It therefore provides either a preemptive or a post hoc rationale for genocide. Again, the key idea here is a psychological or moral sense of distance between the victims and others. So that's the big idea, but how does this work in practice? What are the mechanisms that produce social death? Here we see two theoretical models that explain this process of othering, of producing social death. The one from the left is from Waller in reading 1, whereas the right one is from Moshman in reading 2. And to a certain extent, there's some overlap between the two. So I'll cover some of these mechanisms in turn. The key idea from both of these models is that the production of the other is a process. Okay, so let's start unpacking this. A key initial step in this process is dichotomization, of drawing the boundary between us and them. As Moshman points out in reading 2, and as we saw last week with our other reading by Waller, this part of the process is actually very normal. Just like ethnocentrism and xenophobia are more or less universal functions, the drawing of boundaries between us and them is entirely normal and not necessarily bad or evil. It's really a matter of degrees. It's a key point I'll come back to. But this is the key idea here, is that genocide is an extreme result of normal identity processes. In that sense, dichotomization is a necessary but insufficient condition. Genocide doesn't happen without some form of dichotomization, but more is needed to make it happen. It's another point we'll come back to later on. But let's look a bit closer at this initial step of identity formation. Waller, for example, references a 1954 experiment that was conducted over 3 weeks at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma, I believe, where 22 11 and 12-year-old boys who had never met before were overseen by researchers posing as camp counselors. The boys were split into 2 teams that competed in multiple games with prizes awarded to the winners. The experiment measured feelings of conflict and tension that, as Waller summarizes, became increasingly hostile and aggressive, even though these boys had no prior interaction, and they more or less all came from the same background. So despite this arbitrary group formation, the formation of groups itself was enough to lay the groundwork for conflict. In-group similarities were exaggerated, whereas the out-group was stereotyped, leading to a sharp line being drawn between the two. This experiment inaugurated a body of research called realistic conflict theory, which argues that intergroup conflict occurs when two or more groups compete over scarce but valuable resources. This theory is realist in the sense that conflict and competition isn't based on irrational hatreds, but on actual material interest. In this sense, realistic conflict theory is at odds with social identity theory, which is what we turn to next. Social identity theory is associated with this figure, Henri Tajfel, who is our scholar spotlight this week. Tajfel was born in 1919 Poland, but due to legal restrictions on the number of Jews allowed into higher education during the 1930s, he immigrated to France, where during World War II he actually volunteered to serve in the French military, and he became a prisoner of war under the Nazis, but managed to survive. Still, he lost most of his family during the Holocaust. After the war, he immigrated to England, where he became a professor of social psychology with an important research agenda on social categorization, intergroup relations, and the nature of prejudice. He's most well known for social identity theory, but first, a word of warning. In recent years, it's come to light that Tajfel showed reprehensible and unacceptable behaviors towards female members of his lab. While this does not question Tajfel's theoretical contributions, it does, however, tarnish his legacy, and it poses serious ethical questions for us as researchers. It's something I'd like to hear your thoughts on, but how can we use researchers like this, who may be implicated in larger patterns of sexual harassment? With that said, some of the critical vocabulary we're using this week can be traced back to this research program on social identity theory. In particular, we have a basic conceptual distinction between the in-group, which corresponds with our idea from last week regarding ethnocentrism, and the out-group, which corresponds with the idea of xenophobia. According to social identity theory, a person's self-esteem is based on their sense of belonging to a larger social group, and that the collective self-image of the in-group fosters negative prejudices towards any out-groups. As such, members of an in-group will discriminate against out-groups in order to enhance their own collective self-image. Unlike realistic conflict theory, which is geared towards more or less material interest, social identity theory is geared towards more symbolic and intangible forms of identity. Although with that said, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive theories. In any case, the key point I want to make here is that this in-group bias and out-group discrimination doesn't always lead to violent conflict. However, it does provide a necessary foundation for radicalization and extremism, whereby the accentuation of differences can be ratcheted up to the point where it becomes, or seems to become, a zero-sum conflict, whereby if one side wins, the other necessarily loses. This concept of radicalization overlaps with terrorism studies, where the concept of extremism refers to the belief that an in-group's success or survival can never be separated from the need for hostile action against an out-group. J.M. Berger, whose book you see here, is an expert in terrorism studies, and we can use this concept to highlight the overlap between genocide and terrorism studies. An important point for both is that the process of becoming an extremist is born out of ostensibly normal processes in identity construction that are just taken to the extreme. And we see a similar necessary but insufficient feature with the next mechanism of othering, dehumanization. Reading 5 is co-authored by Nick Haslam, who's been at the forefront of the dehumanization research program for the past decade or so. The literature on dehumanization, as well as the phenomenon itself, extends well beyond the most extreme cases of genocide. This basic tendency to perceive others as less than human is quite common, although much of the literature identifies this phenomenon as a key variable explaining aggression, or worse. For example, this supplementary reading is an essay by Erik Erikson, another Jewish intellectual refugee during World War II, by the way. You may notice a trend here. But Erikson links this related concept of pseudo-speciation, which is basically synonymous with dehumanization, as a key factor in the mentality producing nuclear war, thereby connecting us with another related research program. As I said, however, the process of dehumanization is otherwise quite common and a more general phenomenon, and this leads us to the distinct concept of infrahumanization. This has a similar definition to dehumanization, but it is more subtle and implicit, and less intense than the blatant denial of humanness associated with the narrow conception of dehumanization. In other words, infrahumanization is dehumanization light. There's a spectrum of blatancy, Haslam says, ranging from explicit likenings of people to despised non-humans to weaker, implicit associations of some people with human attributes less than others. How does this continuum model relate to our other readings this week? Does it provide a bit more nuance than that offered by Waller and Moshman in readings 1 and 2? Likewise, does it provide a theoretical analogy to Nancy Shepherd Hughes in reading 4, which we turn to next? Shepherd Hughes is a contemporary American anthropologist who we'll be reading again next week. In this week's reading 4, she makes a radical etiological argument, which is that everyday violence, both symbolic and physical, makes genocide possible. Again, we see this argumentative theme that genocide evolves out of ostensibly normal social practices, and an even greater theoretical detail than Haslam's infrahumanization-dehumanization spectrum. We see in Shepherd Hughes' argument a major emphasis on this notion of a continuum, or a continuous sequence, in which adjacent elements are not perceptibly different from each other, although the extremes are quite distinct. This theoretical model challenges the distinction between genocide per se and those other, more familiar or normal forms of violence that seemingly fall below the threshold of what we typically consider genocide. In other words, seeing genocide on a continuum problematizes the notion that there is an actual threshold that categorically separates genocide, per se, from non-genocide. We instead need to see the invisible connective tissue, so to speak, that connects these extremes. In particular, the author argues that the visible forms of violence that we associate with political violence like warfare actually depend on what she calls invisible forms of violence that are quite common during times of quote-unquote peace. So to elaborate, visible forms of violence are things like conventional wars, political revolutions, and the conventional understanding of genocide defined by mass murder, physical massacres. In contrast, invisible forms of violence fly below the radar, so to speak. They're a bit more quote-unquote normal or everyday forms of violence. To the extent that these invisible forms of violence are typically built into the very fabric of society and our political economies, they're often referred to as forms of structural violence. In picking up with the theme of dehumanization, this invisible violence produces disposable people that reduces groups of people to non-persons, thereby posing a necessary, or at the very least an important or crucial precondition for genocide. Specifically, this idea relates to Haslam's mechanistic form of dehumanization, which imagines the other like a disposable, artificial, quote-unquote thing. Indeed, over the next couple of weeks, we'll be reading some works by Polish-born sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, who's also written a book about how modernity produces human waste, or populations deemed superfluous, such as migrants, refugees, and other outcasts. But let's go back to Haslam's dual model of dehumanization, which rests upon two distinct assumptions of human uniqueness. There's the human-animal distinction, as well as the distinction between humans and artificial machines, quote-unquote things. The latter corresponds with the mechanistic form of dehumanization, which we just looked at. But what about the animalistic form that corresponds with the former distinction, the human-animal distinction? You see here a list of common metaphors that fall under this category of dehumanization. To a certain extent, these metaphors are not distinctly modern, as all groups have notions of pollution and taboo. This work here is a classic in social anthropology that we'll talk about next week, although we see the theme of purity very prominently in this week's reading 3 by Jacques Semelin, which we'll come back to shortly. With that said, this form of dehumanization took on new relevance during the late 19th and early 20th century, with the historical convergence of nationalism and scientific racism as related discourses. We'll talk more about the rise of nationalism a bit more over the following weeks, when we talk about the rise of the nation-state and the tendency to annihilate differences in the political project of constructing uniformity. We'll also talk about the concept of biopolitics as it relates to ideological forms of scientific racism. In any case, it was in this historical context that the image of a society as a body politic became dominant. In this organic metaphor, society is seen to be like an organism, and like any organism, the presence of invasive bodies is a threat. This was also a historical context, mind you, when germ theory was becoming knowledgeable. Thus, as this model was extended to society, suspected outgroup members often deemed to be threats to the in-group, and therefore their expulsion was legitimized as a means of self-preservation. Now, I'm going to pick up on this biopolitical legitimization of destruction as a means of self-preservation in a minute, but let's take stock over where we've come thus far. Going back to Waller's and Moshman's models, we've seen two more or less necessary but insufficient conditions for genocide. Both dichotomization and dehumanization are generally normal social functions that don't necessarily lead to genocide. but still they may lead down a path that ultimately precipitates more extreme forms of mass violence and social suffering. But still, in order to escalate into these more extreme forms of violence, there must be something else. What's the missing ingredient? This finally leads us to Semmelin in reading 3, where he links the aforementioned ideas of identity and purity with a sense of security, or rather insecurity. And it's this linkage that makes otherwise normal forms of social identity categorization especially extreme. In particular, he highlights fear and paranoia as key social sentiments that lead to violent extremism. These are more general social structures of feeling that tend to have a broader effect. Now, there are people who help structure this fear as hatred, Semmelin says, and they often do so by peddling in conspiracy theories. We'll come back to this in week 7 when we re-examine this sense of delusional rationality and collective psychopathology as part of the strategic logic of genocide. Indeed, a lot of what Semmelin is talking about towards the end of reading 3 foreshadows the work of Mark Levine, who we'll be reading later. As you'll see over the coming weeks, we're going to be venturing into the social imaginaries of the perpetrators. We're not attempting to excuse or condone them, of course not, but to understand how ostensibly ordinary people and otherwise regular social processes can radicalize into extraordinary acts of genocide. In particular, we're going to pick up later on this idea of what I'm calling the perpetrator-victim paradox. It's a paradox because, on the one hand, genocide is typically one-sided, at least in the act of killing, where there's a clear power differential between the perpetrators and the victims. On the other hand, the perpetrators see themselves locked in an existential conflict with their actual victims. So according to this imaginary threat perception, there's a role reversal, whereby the actual perpetrators see themselves as victims, and the actual victims are instead recast as dangerous, even existential threats. Now, for the last 2 slides, I want to share some content from the supplemental readings that are still important. First is this 2015 article by the Dutch sociologist Anthony Holslag, entitled The Process of Othering, From the Social Imaginary to Physical Acts. This title makes a key point I'm going to come to in a second, but first I want to review a couple of important insights from this article that just add to our discussion this week. First is what Freud calls the narcissism of small differences, which Semmelin talked about, and which we'll see again next week with our reading by Arjun Appadurai. As far as we're concerned this week, is the idea that there's an intrinsic connection between the in-group and the out-group. Indeed, rather than identifying these as 2 separate categories of people, as in the grammatical form of a noun, we can instead see these in the grammatical form of a verb, thereby distinguishing 2 intrinsically interrelated processes of selfing and othering. But anyways, the idea with the narcissism of small differences is that the presumed differences between the 2 sides of this coin are often quite minuscule, hard to point out in reality. In order to exploit and exaggerate these minor differences, so-called identity entrepreneurs play an important role in galvanizing and radicalizing public opinion. The author discusses this particular figure from the Young Turk movement, who was instrumental in the intellectual background behind the Armenian genocide. This famous Turkish sociologist, poet, and nationalist exploited collective sentiments of anxiety and humiliation and contributed to this inverse victim-perpetrator dynamic. Again, we'll come back to this paradox in the coming weeks. This is just a good example of what we're talking about. But let's get back to the title of the slide, which relates the imaginary element of genocide to its physical acts. We need to problematize the continuum model from Haslam, and especially Schepper-Hughes. To what extent does Schepper-Hughes' approach blur the exceptional nature of genocide? On the one hand, her continuum model usefully places genocidal violence in a broader context. She reminds us that violence is not only physical, but also symbolic. Stigmatizing individuals, excluding them from social and political bodies can indeed be considered as violent acts. Indeed, that's one of the key themes this week. On the other hand, however, there's still an important difference between the idea of genocide and the act itself. Identity entrepreneurs, such as this famous Turkish nationalist, weren't the ones actually pulling the trigger, so to speak. I mean, there are plenty of people that talk the talk, but never actually walk the walk. So how do we explain the gap between genocidal discourse on the one hand and genocidal activity on the other? Stated differently, what's the difference between the potentiality and actuality of genocide? The link between the idea of genocide, in a more symbolic sense, and the act of genocide in a physical sense was very much at stake in Julius Streicher's conviction at Nuremberg. He was another identity entrepreneur who never actually killed anyone. Rather, Streicher was convicted as an accessory to murder because his propaganda campaign obviously facilitated the crime through incitement. Streicher's hate speech cultivated the social imaginary of the perpetrators. And it's worth noting that although the Genocide Convention includes the crime of incitement, this provision was limited by the Americans who were concerned that it would interfere with the right to free speech. In American political legal culture, hate speech has to be connected with criminal acts in a physical sense. This occludes the link between symbolic acts of violence with their physical manifestations. And this is the challenge of criminalizing incitement, because it is an inchoate crime, meaning that it does not yet have to be fully formed in order to qualify. In other words, genocide doesn't actually have to occur in order for the crime of incitement to be proven, at least in theory. In practice, the international legal canon remains dominated by an extremely narrow understanding of the intent element of the crime that effectively neutralizes any broad reading of the provision against incitement. That's a much longer discussion, but the key point here is that our perspective tends to be skewed towards the physical acts of genocide at the expense of its symbolic dimensions as well. Finally, I threw in an article at the end of this week's module by political scientist Leanne Fuji, who unfortunately passed away just before she could complete a book that was thankfully published posthumously. You're reading an early version of this project, which is essentially concerned with public enactments of violence. Her theory combines both the physical and symbolic dimensions of violence, which performs an important meaning-making function. When actors put violence on display, they are bringing ideas to life about how the world should be ordered. The key element that constitutes an episode as a violent display is staging, a theatrical term that refers to how the director physically arranges bodies, objects, light, sound, and set pieces to create a particular stage picture. This theory is drawing from a sociological paradigm known as dramaturgy, which uses the theater metaphor to explain micro-level social interactions. In this sense, the theory proposes the concept of casting to explain pathways towards participation in violent displays. Some perpetrators took on quote-unquote star roles, while others took on a more supporting role. And meanwhile, audience members were also a crucial part of the meaning-making process. Indeed, this symbolic dimension of meaning-making is important to understand how ostensibly normal people can commit extraordinary acts of violence. Violent displays are effectively processes of socialization that serve to reinscribe what it means to belong to a specific category, group, or side, and makes going along with the violence the basis for belonging. As such, mass violence is understood to be a process of group making, so there's a productive dimension to genocide in this sense, at least as far as the perpetrators are concerned. Okay, and that's it. As usual, we have our discussion form assignments. You should also be staying on top of your annotated bibliography assignment, the first part of which is due next week. Also, by the end of this week, you need to send me your topic for the historiographical essay. Just a short proposal plus a few references. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.